Shalom, this is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. It is Sunday, May the 6th, 2018, and today is the oft overlooked Feast of Firstfruits. This feast tends to get overlooked just because it gets overshadowed by everyone, concentrating on the Passover and the Passover Seder and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. But the Feast of Firstfruits is actually a very important day, even though it's not considered a Sabbath. This is the day, of course, that Yahshua presented himself to the Father as the first fruit from among the dead. So if you go to Leviticus 23, you find that during the 7 days of unleavened bread, which is spoken about in verses 6 and 7 and 8, right in the midst of that, you find that on the morrow after the Sabbath, during that Passover week, is the Feast of Firstfruits. And it starts in verse 9. It says, "And Yahweh spake unto Moshe, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and saying to them, When you be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof," that's referring to the barley harvest, which is the very first harvest of the year, "then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest unto the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." And, of course, that's always a Sunday, or basically Saturday night to Sunday night. It's the morrow after the Sabbath within the 7 days of unleavened bread. "And you shall offer that day, when you wave the sheaf, an he-lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering unto Yahweh. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2/10 deals of fine flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire unto Yahweh for a sweet savor. And the drink offering thereof shall be of wine the 4th part of an hin. And ye shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that ye have brought an offering unto your Yah. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, and in all your dwellings." And of course, if you continue to read on, this day of first fruits is also important, in that it's the first countdown, the counting of the Omer, that is a 50-day countdown to the next spring feast, which is Shavuot. So first fruits is actually a very, very important day, because it begins that 50-day countdown to Shavuot, and determines when Shavuot will be. And of course, this day is important because not only was it the day that the Israelites would bring their first sheaf of their barley harvest to the high priest to wave as a thanksgiving offering for Yah sustaining them, but it's symbolic of Yahshua's resurrection and ascension. So it's spoken of directly by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where it says in verse 20, "But now is Messiah risen from the dead, and become the firstfruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Messiah shall all be made alive. But every man in his own order, Messiah the firstfruits, and afterward they that are Messiahs at his coming." So Yahshua is the firstfruit from among the dead. He fulfills this Feast of Firstfruits. Again, every year for thousands of years, the Israelites would bring a first shock of their barley harvest, which is the very first harvest of the year. It's in the early spring. And they would bring a shock of their barley harvest, the first sheaf of their barley harvest, up with them to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And on the morrow after the Sabbath, within Passover week, so whatever day that Saturday night to Sunday night fell on, in the midst of the 7 days of unleavened bread, they would then bring that shock up to the high priest, and the high priest would wave that shock of barley before Yahweh. And then there was a detailed sacrifice that would go along with that. They would do this every year as a sort of a thanksgiving, acknowledging that Yah was sustaining them and giving them their first harvest of the year to survive. And this was done every year on the morrow after the Sabbath. And of course, if we skip forward then to Yahshua being the Passover lamb, he died on Passover. He was buried for unleavened bread, and the firstfruits, the Feast of Firstfruits, which would have been from Saturday night to Sunday night, that is when he rose. He rose from the dead, late Sabbath, and then early in the morning on Sunday, which would have been the Feast of Firstfruits that year. That's when Miriam and the other women found the empty tomb. And, of course, then it was discovered that Yahshua had risen from the grave. Mary then actually meets the risen Yahshua and wants to embrace him, but he says, "Don't touch me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father." So he still needed to go up to the Father and wave himself as the first fruit from among the dead, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. So that's how he fulfilled this feast. So the question often arises, well, how come the Feast of Firstfruits, with it being so important? I mean, it's the day that Yahshua rose from the dead and ascended to the Father and presented himself as the first fruit from among the dead. How come it's not a Sabbath? Why is this not a Shabbat? Well, the reason it's not a Sabbath is because the Feast of Firstfruits is a lot of work. I mean, he rose from the dead and he ascended to heaven. That's a lot of work that he did on that day. And the Israelites themselves, it was a work day because they would get their sheep, they would go to the temple, they'd bring their sheep to the high priest. The high priest would be waving these sheep all day long, starting probably Saturday night, going through Sunday. So it was a day of work, just like Passover was a day of work. And of course, it's celebrating the fact that he rose from the dead, he resurrected, he's the first fruits from among the dead. And because he fulfilled the Feast of Firstfruits 2,000 years ago, because he is the first fruits from among the dead, because he did present himself as the first fruit offering to the Father, that is what gives us hope for our future resurrection, which will be fulfilled in the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, which is the first of the fall feasts that we celebrate in September or October. So this feast is actually a very important feast. There's several verses that are devoted to this feast in Leviticus 23. So it's definitely not a day to overlook, but it's not a Sabbath either. It's a work day. I'm actually recording this during my break during work here. So I wish you all a very happy Feast of Firstfruits. And tonight, it just so happens that tonight, the way the calendar is this year, starts the 7th day of Unleavened Bread. So tonight into tomorrow, May 7th, is a high Sabbath, a Shabbat. It's the day that we're not to work or do any business or buy and sell, but it's a high Shabbat, and it's that last day of Unleavened Bread, the 7th day of Unleavened Bread. And I'll make another teaching for the 7th day of Unleavened Bread tomorrow. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. Website is www.spiritandtorah.com. Shalom.